All right. So we've been on this journey for the last several months reading occult science. I'm going to say really just a few words about chapter 7, the last 20 pages or so of this book, which it's mostly review. It's called Details from the Domain of Spiritual Science. I'm not positive, but I get the sense that Steiner probably added this in one of the um, later editions to clear up remaining questions about some details. So I'll just briefly share what he covers, and then I'd really love for us to have some extra time for dialogue about the text as a whole. Um, so he begins with a discussion of the ether body and how, in order to for the uh, person on this path of spiritual development, cultivating these higher organs of perception to perceive the ether body, that we need to be able to exercise willpower to, in a sense, annihilate our sense perceptions um, of other people, so that we can then begin to spiritually perceive the etheric body, and that this can come in the form of color, of tone, um, and that it's very different from our normal perception of the sensory world, where we get the clear, distinct percept first. Steiner says as we begin to be able to perceive spiritually, it begins as a kind of dim uh, inner image that then takes on life and vitality, and that at first it can be difficult to distinguish hallucination from reality, as we've discussed in earlier chapters about the nascent spiritual perceptions. There's so much of our own will and intention mixed with what we end up perceiving. And so that takes a great deal of training of the will primarily. He then talks about the astral body and the astral world, and reminds us that while from the perspective of our physical senses, when we look up at the heavens, we see the sun, we see the moon. At night, we see the other planets and the stars. Um, Steiner makes clear that supersensibly perceived, when we rise to these higher spheres of spiritual perception and cognition, there's actually no longer a separation between these planetary bodies, that they are actually all part of one supersensible body. And I think he intends us to imagine this both spatially and temporally. Um, in the sense that, we can supersensibly perceive uh, the remnants of the old moon on the earth, and similarly old sun, old Saturn. Um, and so he's not, I think, inviting us to think of some kind of spiritual uh, cloud or something floating in space where all the planets would be part of this one amorphous nebulous cloud, but rather to really put this into a temporal developmental dimension as well, that to supersensibly perceive the solar system as one organism is to perceive it as a developing embryo through time as much as an organism in space right now. And this is for him a justification of the name astral body, that when we go to sleep, um, our astral body is drawn away from our physical body here on Earth, and begins to participate in these um, other planetary spheres and stellar worlds. He talks a bit about life after death, again, mostly review, the gradual fading away of the memory um, of this life as the etheric and astral bodies begin to separate. He talks about the etheric seed that is formed, a little extract, uh, the fruiting body, as it were, with the seed inside of the etheric that will continue to the next life. Um, he talks about the timing of reincarnation, that the I will only come back when the conditions in the physical world have changed sufficiently for there to be new experiences possible. Um, He connects this to the Platonic year with the precession of the equinox, 26,000 years, and that it's roughly every 2,100 years that an I will incarnate, but twice during that period, both as a man as a woman. And he says that these are just sort of general tendencies, that in reality, um, there will be many and manifold individual variations to these loose rules or tendencies. He talks about the stages of man's life, that while the physical body is born and separates from the mother, there's still a 7-year period before the etheric body is fully born, another 7 years to age 14 or so before the etheric body is fully born, and then um, the I or ego at 21, followed by the subtler development of the soul, sentient soul, intellectual soul, and spiritual or consciousness soul. That there really is a lifetime process of development and maturation, and that at some point, as we age, the astral body begins to feed on the etheric body, spiritually feed, and similarly the etheric on the physical body, um, and that this is, Steiner says, the supersensible cause of aging. Um, he makes it clear that these stages of development up through imagination, inspiration, and intuition are not at all, when we reach intuition, that's not the top rung of the ladder, and that we begin to recognize that these spiritual hierarchies continue indefinitely, and that the spiritual world itself is evolving. And so this is a long, if not infinite, journey, right? Um, and while we can distinguish between higher and lower, Steiner makes it clear to us that, while from our perception as earthly human beings at this stage of our development, our own capacities for reason are clearly much more refined than the actions and sort of chemical reactivity of the mineral realm. But for the sublime worlds, he says, to which we are now referring, reason, our activity of reasoning has approximately the same value as have the mineral reactions on the earth, right? And so um, this great chain of being is quite great indeed. Um, what else do I want to share here? I think I'll stop there and give us ample time just to discuss the entire book. If anything in particular about these last couple of review sections that Steiner adds in chapter 7 is of interest, we can certainly talk about that. But I think, the whole book should be on the table here. I'm really curious to see and hear from those of you who are reading this for the first time. I don't know if anyone is reading it for the first time, but if so, just what's your impression of it? Um, and I'll share my general impressions as we go here. But Rosemary, please.
I'm not able to answer that question because I'm an old hand at this. So maybe I could come, if somebody new wants to answer that question, maybe this would be a good time for that person to come forward.
We can come back around to that, Rosemary. You can go ahead and share whatever you were thinking.
Well, I wanted to call everybody's attention to a paragraph in chapter 6. It's the paragraph where he talks about the knowledge of the Holy Grail. In my edition, it's on page 305, George and Mary Adams translation. So in this particular place, he's emphasizing that the faculties of the hidden knowledge, which is gradually taking hold of mankind, is increasing These faculties will more and more find satisfaction and fulfillment in the higher knowledge. It will be evident increasingly as time goes on. We are now living at a time when the higher knowledge needs to be far more widely received into the general consciousness of mankind than hitherto. It is with this in view that the present work has been written. So and he says in one of the prefaces, this is like one of the basic texts of anthroposophy. He doesn't say it's like the Bible, but it's like a basic book. So those are my two ideas, is that he put this out there as a formal text in 1909, knowing that he would get the same kind of, hostile, cynical, unaccepting reactions from great numbers of people, but he wanted to get it out there because of an inner call to put this on record for everybody who's going to be taking up this path. I feel like it's the handbook that, as you're continuing on the spiritual path, this incarnation, next incarnation, we can always come back to this book to get a lot of basic orientation. And that was also what I felt about this chapter 7, is that he just felt like, oh, I need to clarify these several things according to my thinking of 1910, 1920, whatever year it was, so that it'll be on record for those coming later.
Yeah, definitely an important text that could have been 5 times as long because of all of the detail that he fills in other lectures. That it really is somewhat schematic in places, though it's clear that there are more details that he could have shared in this text. It's an outline, as he says in the title. Laura, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the summary. And I definitely have been looking forward to this meeting all week. After having studied with all of you, I didn't want to miss this. So I just want to respond to what Rosemary pointed out, because I think about this a lot too in regard to this basic handbook, this basic knowledge, and how this worldview can change your entire life, the quality of your life, um, the purpose of your life, and how to bring that to everyday life. And so it's wonderful to study with other people who are studying the same thing, but it's obvious that not everyone out there is going to is at that point where they're studying this material in such depth and with other people who are doing it so earnestly. And so I am always looking for ways to bring the information. I feel like because of what Steiner brought in regard to this no longer being esoteric, in the sense that it could cause danger if these um, truths were talked about. Certainly, I try to bring it in a reverential way and not sort of an offhand way, but in day-to-day daily conversation, if I can bring it around to some of these concepts and some of these ideas, because I find that other people are earnestly seeking the spirit as well. And rather than hand them this book and say, here, read this, there are times when I point to what I'm studying as just an example of something you can do if you're interested in furthering your understanding of the spiritual world. But I feel like even just bringing these concepts in daily conversation can spark things in people, because they're earnestly seeking this. They're earnestly seeking this information, and the way that Rudolf Steiner brought it is a way that you can make it your own through work and study, but in such a way that then you can share it with others in a way that can be accessible to them, where they are, rather than telling them to like read the book and study it for 6 years or something, and then we can have a conversation. So I appreciate what Rosemary said, about it being important for it to get out there to the world at large.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. It makes me think about in what you're sharing the difference between information and formation. Um, there's clearly a sense in which Steiner is trying to provide information to us about a realm that most of us cannot directly perceive. But he's also trying to provide us with a means of forming ourselves, like in the German sense of Bildung, um, and that process of formation is something that is quite different than the receiving of information um, already ready-made. There's a process, a formative process that this text invites us to go through by providing these exercises so that what initially is received as information could be, in a sense, could take root and flower within us as direct perception, right? Not just as a report from somebody else. And that's the challenge here. 100 years later, 100 years plus, to what extent has the informational part of this text become accessible through the uh, exercises that are suggested in this text so that information can become the result of our own formation. And I think that's the crux of it for me. Um, you know,
As well as ever evolving capacities. You know, we're different than we were 100 years ago as a, you know, I mean, maybe not amazingly different, but different.
mhm. Right. Jeff K, please.
Hello, good morning. I'm really appreciating what is being said already today, and I'm thinking of a particular point from chapter 7. Um, he says that what he teaches in this book and really in general, you know, in all his writings, is I'm going to maybe change his words a little bit, but I think I'm getting the right idea. Is really a path of pure thinking, right? A cognitive path, you know, a certain path of spiritual unfoldment. And I don't remember if it's in this book or elsewhere. He talks about that as being really the safe conservative path, and there's reasons for that, right? He's really cautioned against all kinds of you know, whatever, just really diverting from that and the dangers that can be involved in that. But yeah, he lays this out as his primary teaching, the path of pure thinking, as I'm calling it. But he also says there is another path, not generally as accessible in our modern condition, and he says that's the path of feeling. And that's very interesting. And I forget exactly now what he says here in this chapter about that, but the idea or the impression I get, you know, it's of course it still happens. People can go off to a monastery and kind of have a vow of devoting their life to prayer and meditation and this kind of thing. And what he does say in this chapter is that we don't have access to that in the modern condition. And of course, he hasn't even seen, the internet and social media and anything else like that. But the principle, of course, is still there, that we're just bombarded and we can't sustain a feeling for a length of time, right? And as he says it in this chapter, on that path of feeling, by sustaining a given mode of feeling over a period of time, we actually develop a particular spiritual capacity as a result. And he's not making it mutually exclusive, like he says it, that doesn't his path of thinking is not devoid of feeling. Like on the contrary, it actually very deeply helps develop that as well. But he does highlight this other path, and I find that very interesting for many reasons. But I just simply want to make one point about that here this morning, which is And sort of I'm echoing a little bit of what Laura just said a moment ago as well, that my experience being in this group, for the last 2 years, whatever it's been, as we've gone through the different texts, is this group carries and embodies a particular feeling. That's my experience anyways. And my development, my engagement with Steiner's content through this group has been this kind of sustained meditation on the feeling embodied in this group, and a little bit of what's hinted at, what Steiner points to, this kind of coming age and where our consciousness is going and all that. This group kind of embodies very distinctly that feeling of of aiming towards those future states of consciousness. We're all on our own path and our own content that we're working on and everything, but there is still a common feeling. So I just want to echo that. That stood out for me in chapter 7 as to this alternate path. As say, well, none of us, I don't imagine, are on that kind of monastery path. We all kind of have a modern lifestyle one way or another, but however, we can have different engagements with this life of feeling, and we all do it in our own way. But I just find that very interesting as part of this whole developmental process.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for mentioning that. About these two paths, I didn't mention that in my summary, but it strikes me as 100 years plus after Steiner said that about how difficult it was already in, the 19 teens or whatever to withdraw enough from the hustle and bustle of common life for the feeling path to actually work. Yeah, nowadays with the saturation of our environment by these electronic media technologies are that really cater to our will and our feeling life in a very unconscious way. So much more difficult to pursue any spiritual path except that through thinking, where we really do need to individuate from these attention capturing, emotionally manipulative forms of media. So the path of thinking is even more important today, I think. Lorenzo, please.
Thanks. Uh, yeah, first of all, I'd like um, to say that working together in the group is really stirring. It's really useful for going deeper, and uh, most of the things that I've been thinking lately regarding the text that we've been reading together came up during the sessions themselves. And yeah, of course, I also thought something while I was reading by myself, but most of the time it's really the interaction and listening to what you say that brings forward new thoughts, and it's an incredible tool. It's so good to have found that we have found each other. It's really great grace and luck. And I wanted also to say that reading the book this time, maybe since I've been also reading Barfield at the same time, made me think about Barfield's more famous friend, Tolkien. And I don't know how much are you familiar with Tolkien's mythology, Tolkien's so-called legendarium, his Silmarillion, his stories. But I've been thinking that there are a lot of points of common with what we read here in Steiner, and that we might maybe think of Tolkien as one who did experiment with clairvoyancy, maybe not in exactly the same way that Steiner did. Maybe he reached the same visions through the study of languages and etymologies. and of course there are deep connections, and also maybe this brings me the additional thought that Steiner could have said something more about language in this book, that maybe a specifically linguistic chapter would have helped. Of course, that's something that maybe pertains more to the earlier texts, yet this is a kind of big overview, and so maybe more considerations of the relationship between images and poetry, and let's say a Barfieldian chapter inside this book. I think it would have helped a lot it to be appreciated more philosophical level, more rational level, because this book is like the perfect outcast. It is so good in its singularity, and the fact that it kind of doesn't even try, like some earlier texts, to mingle with the academic mindset, but just go straight to the facts. And but this can be a limit. And yeah, anyway, thinking about Tolkien, if we just think about this last chapter, when he says connecting to the spiritual part of the world also connects to other worlds. And if we think about Tolkien's idea that there were eras in his legendarium, and in the former eras there was part of the world that was still connected to the main world, to what we call the Middle Earth, where the angels, or let's say the divine beings, lived, and then detached, and only the elves can reach that Valinor, so it's called, that part where that once was connected to our world, but now isn't. And if one thinks also about the relationship between the what elves are and what humans are, and humans being characterized by the fact that they have free will, but that this free will at the same time gives them the destiny of death, unlike the elves. And so if one thinks about Tolkien's world, maybe not just, the Lord of the Rings, the most known stuff, but the little more esoteric stuff around the Silmarillion, one recognizes that there is a strong, if it is not directly an anthroposophical influence, then we can say maybe that's a separate experiment with many common examples, and also a way to look at the past eras that we read in this book from another point of view, which is not just subjectively invented, but that did have some strong scientific or pseudo-scientific intent to it. And yeah, well, that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Lorenzo. I've wondered how much Barfield was whispering in Tolkien's ear about anthroposophy. I mean, we know that he was talking about this with his Inkling friends. Lewis was not as receptive as Tolkien, but I don't know too many of the details in terms of how directly influenced Tolkien was. But it's very clear that Tolkien has, I mean, I don't know exactly, but it seems like at least his imaginative capacities are quite pronounced, and that he is perceiving some kind of real structure in the spiritual world that he's conveying through his the Silmarillion, through the Lord of the Rings. And so it's quite a striking example of, I think, the influence that Steiner has had on the popular culture, even if it's somewhat less known. Um, yeah. Karsten, please.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to add to what Jeffy said about the feeling connected to this group, or you could say perhaps the energy, because I was not looking for anyone studying Steiner, but I just happened to stumble upon this group and found it on YouTube and was I mean immediately connected with this kind of feeling energy that is part of this group. So I mean, for my sake, we could read so many other things. It's actually quite accidental for me in a sense that we're reading Steiner. The only Steiner book I ever read before I met this group was Philosophy of Freedom, which I've read a number of times, and I really cherish that book. But I somehow Steiner never attracted my attention apart from that. So I really like the energy of the group, and I would continue even if we went on to study other things than Steiner. But Steiner is also okay for me, and also, I mean, I'm one of these persons who haven't read this book before, and it's been a very rewarding experience. And I think what I've kind of I couldn't say it's new for me, but I've I feel like I've strengthened this connection between the ability to experience the world more fully and the formation of our own being. So there's some kind of interaction going on there. That there's a world we can experience more fully, but to experience it more fully, some kind of formation, Bildung, have to happen within. And I can see how Stein is kind of working with that all the time and inspiring and invigorating this process. So that has been hugely rewarding. Also, I want to say a little about Barfield because I've been inspired by, I think, especially Aston's very frequent mentioning of Owen Barfield. So I also started, actually this week, I started reading 70 Appearances and connected with something that I read in this chapter 7, which has to do with this ability to become aware of the etheric energy kind of penetrating physical space. And I think that this kind of deconstruction or decomposition that Barfield is making of the process of perception in the introductory chapters of Saving the Appearances was very helpful and reminded me of something. I mean, again, it's not new to me. I've encountered this kind of thinking before, but it was strengthened. But he has this decomposition where he distinguishes between there's what the activity of the sense organs, you could say, and then there is what he calls figuration, which is something we ourselves contribute to the perception. And then there is thinking, and he has two phases of thinking, what he calls alpha thinking and beta thinking, where after we've figured what we experience, we can think about it. So that's one level of reflection. But then we can think about our thinking as well, and this whole process that he describes. And that's another level of reflection. And what it did for me is that it reminded me that when we look at physical space around, so every one of us, we're sitting in this physical room, we have these everyday things surrounding us. There's a lamp, there's a chair, and so on. Or if I go outside, I can see a car. What it reminded me is how satiated our experience of physical space is with spiritual content. So we can ask our question, what is actually left if we remove this collective process of figuration and our thinking about things? what's the physical part that will actually be left behind? And of course, you can discuss that. Is it particles? Is it quantum fields? Whatever. Personally, I think it's something along the lines that Schelling suggested, that what we see as matter is actually some kind of dynamic equilibrium between contractive movement and repulsive movement. But that's a discussion you could have. But most of what we experience in physical space is actually spiritual content. The fact that I see a car as a car, the concept of car is not a physical thing, it's an idea. And I'm just reminded about that. And when I like read these chapters of Barfield's, it has the effect on me that physical space suddenly become less physical, or less dense. It acquires a lighter quality. I somehow suddenly feel that I'm in some kind of virtual space. And of course, it's not the same as I'm not creating it personally, because it's a shared space. It's a shared experience we have. It's a collective representation, as Barfield puts it. So I just want to throw in how we're sometimes caught up, or very often, frequently, we are caught up in this illusion that we are in physical space, whereas we are spiritual beings having some kind of physical experience that is actually mostly spiritual as well, because there's so much spiritual content that satiates and penetrates whatever the physical residue is. So I think that can be helpful in terms of connecting to these higher realms in a gradual process. I have one more point, and it's the point of, I'd call it a point of skepticism. And that's when Stein is talking about reincarnation, and the fact that you, in a certain interval, you incarnate twice, once as a man and once as a woman. I'm very skeptical towards that, because I think there's a principle of continuity here that, at least for me, it's kind of underlie all kinds of thinking, that all progress, all evolution is something that happens gradually and continuously. And I think the step from being a man to becoming a woman, or the other way around, is actually a huge step. It reminds me a bit of, I mean, these Eastern ideas about reincarnation, where if you don't behave properly, you will be incarnated as a frog or a lamb or some kind of animal the next time. I don't believe in that, because of this principle of continuity, because of the fact that we do not change drastically just because we leave incarnation and then reincarnate again. So that's just a point of skepticism for me in terms of what Stein is sharing here.
Thanks, Karsten. Very rich contributions. I'll just say briefly about Barfield that I feel like he performed a similar service for Steiner as Coleridge did for Schelling and Fichte and German idealism, sort of translating it into English so that the English-speaking world, and then in some sense the consciousness soul, could more deeply drink from Steiner's well. Of course, Coleridge didn't always acknowledge when he was sampling from Schelling's texts. Barfield was more careful about that. But yeah, Saving the Appearances is a really important study in the nature of perception and in thinking that I think helps. It's a great study guide for philosophy of freedom. I think those texts should really be read in tandem. Angus, please.
Yeah, good evening, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you again. You had a really rich conversation last week, and there was one subject in there that I thought about quite a bit. I wasn't going to bring it up, But because of what Karsten said, I am going to bring it up because I think it's relevant. I experiences it. I had sort of like said, okay, we won't bring it up, but I think the spirit watching over our conversation is like saying, Angus, you need to. I might be wrong on that one, but I'll do that. And then I wanted to make a brief point about the whole text as well, something I came across recently. I think Karsten's point is deep skepticism is really important to think about what's being said there, because Steiner, he tells us time and time and again, don't believe me. So do your homework, go away and become clairvoyant, and then you'll know. But he's also clear on the point that just because we feel something, if we're going to use our feelings to adjudicate what's true and what's not true, then we're on a slippery slope to nowhere. So we have these feeling reactions to the various things that he says, but getting stuck in those feelings and rejecting something that he says because your feeling life doesn't like it is hugely problematic. And he says it multiple times in multiple texts, and I am in full agreement with him on that point, and therefore I'm stating it to the group so that it's been said clearly and obviously. If I could take like a simple analogy, gravity doesn't care whether we believe in it or not, doesn't care whether we like it or not. Aging is the same, all of these processes. And there's a whole bunch of philosophers who will go to town on those people, so like how cruel nature is. I think particularly, this isn't a philosopher, it's Lorenzo might know him, Leopoldi. It's like he's particularly about the cruelty of nature on the human being. Yeah, I think it's that's what I wanted to bring to the conversation. The other point was one of these wonderful fortuitous discoveries. I've been doing a deep dive into the Bhagavad Gita for the last couple of months after something rather special happened. And I was listening to 142, a GA 142, whilst I was clearing out my garage this morning. And lo and behold, what do I hear? Steiner, so like saying, he says, you know what we found? If you read the Vedas carefully, then many of the descriptions that are there, as like in the beginning of the occult science about the Saturn, the warmth state and the will, they're there in the Vedas as well. And this is particularly interesting because he says, he also connects this to we are used to thinking about our individual personalities and not our individuality, that spiritual being that's standing visibly behind us the whole time. And he points out that this, when the Bhagavad Gita made its way to the West, this also represented a fundamental change in like our own experiences of selves. We've been basically since Greek times living in our personalities in these individual incarnations, but we are moving towards a time where we are going to, according to him, wake up to these to this pre-Greek time. So it's like 3,000 plus years ago time, which is also the philosophical ground out of which Buddhism grew, which he points out. And yeah, so it was I'm rambling a little bit here, but the key message I wanted to bring across was like GA 142, which is the Bhagavad Gita in the Epistles of St. Paul. He goes into some depth about this aspect of although he knew nothing about the Vedic truths there when he wrote his when he wrote the esoteric science, they've already been written before, and many of the concepts are identical.
Yeah. Thanks, Angus. So it sounds like you're describing the return of and the importance of in our time as we move into the sixth cultural epoch, recovering. Well, we're still in the fifth, but as we recover the sentient soul of the third epoch, that's prior to this Greek intellectual soul period that really individuated us, um, that we need also to recover that sense of, I guess it's a kind of cosmic sensitivity to uh, the kind of spiritual environment that the intellectual soul internalized or cut us off from and internalized. And maybe that's related to Bruce, what you were mentioning in the comments earlier about these experiences that you're noticing in other groups of sort of archangelic presence and awareness, that this sentient soul is beginning to open up again for us. Jeff, please.
Well, I'm just totally overwhelmed. It's hard to find the language to put the sort of emotional configurations into something that is coherent for me right now, because um, but I'll just pick a couple of things and maybe I'll form it as a question. Maybe that's a wise thing to do when you're, I won't say I'm confused. I really identify with what Karsten was saying, which is there's a spiritual saturation in our environment, and it's here all the time. And it's a language speaking to us all the time. And we can experience it internally as the structures, psycho-spiritual structures of our soul. And um, and so it's a phenomenological, cognitive, scientific reality that we're all playing with all the time. And I think I agree with that idea that the sentient soul holds a sort of key between um, what our physiological life processes and our soul cognitive processes, and that is that sort of doorway is a kind of potential inversion through a personal experience into a cosmic experience. And there are a couple of examples of this. One is when he talks about what the astral body, how it's bound to the physical and the etheric body throughout life, and this sort of doesn't interrupt, but it slows down its development to because of that binding, and then when it's free of those influences, then it is perceiving in cosmic space. And when he speaks about this, the sort of cosmic forms as one thing, I think of the human organism as that. So we're talking about all of the organs. They're not they're isomorphically there as entities that are totally in process interpenetrating each other. And so the idea that he brings about bringing the language of ensoulment in the last note, in the last note of the book, as again some way to provide for that which is reality in the cosmos, phenomenologically speaking, that is also a reality for us as individuals, just going around every single day. Um, and and so with that in mind, I see this connection, and you all might not, but I can't articulate it, so I'll just ask the question. In the first note, he talks about memory, and I was really hooked by that when the first time through, and I commented on it, and it's still it's adjacent to my understanding, but I have a strong feeling for this idea that memory isn't what we think it is. And if death is to the physical body, sort of ontologically inherent to the physical body, sleep is to the etheric, and forgetting to the astral, how is memory related to forgetting, sleep, and death? What is memory in relationship to being, that it's inherent to the ontological sphere of I-ness. And I think these two lines of rather stumbling communication are what I'm trying to get at. These two things are very much connected: the nature of memory and the nature of the ever-present adjacency of this spiritual world. And then finally, to illustrate the ever-present adjacency, it's interesting that he uses in the first part of this chapter, he uses color and warmth as phenomenological experiences in the soul, that once you take them away, once you take the outer stimulus away and you get past self-deception, that what is present is presence, is a being of soul spiritual nature. And I think that's the adjacency. I think we're talking about the intimacy with beings that is available to us and not theoretical. And I also think that we're talking about, in our feelings about this group, recognizing that we're spiritual beings, becoming intimate with spiritual beings by a process of adduction, of asking for these beings to be present.
Yeah, thanks for all of that, Jeff. You got me thinking about memory and the way in which it seems to be an expression of where our conscious thinking has penetrated deeply enough into both feeling but willing in particular. And it's the degree to which we have this memory capacity as human beings at this stage in our evolution is the degree to which the thinking of the ego has penetrated into the will, right? The memory is exercising the will consciously, and so not sleeping in the will anymore. Seems to be part of it, at least.
That's a very important, if I may, that's a very important point you're making, because in that section, I think it might be before or later in that section, that the first note refers to on memory, he sort of refers to three kinds of memory, and that the I, as the bearer of memory, or that which is inherent to the I, is memory, which gives it well, he says in the soul, the feeling for the I, and in my text that is italicized feeling, but the feeling for the I is well, it's a key to the point being made, and so what I'm trying to get at is that the I is present in relationship to the physical body. It's present in the etheric body. It's present in the astral body. So it's having a different experiences of what memory might be in all three of these bodies. And I think somewhere in there is the answer to this question: what the relationship of death, sleeping, and forgetting is to memory.
Thanks, Jeff. James, please.
I never heard of Steiner before until about 2022. Came upon it, my logarithm in YouTube. Then I stumbled upon this group. And one thing this book gives to me is like a hope. There's some hope. Because meaning. I think they always say I'm at a crisis, a meaning. I have no meaning, but not only just in science, but also in religion and faith. And I had this, I'm going to read this passage, and it says a lot to me. This has a new meaning for me. I can live these words, and it's from 2 Corinthians 4:16. We do not lose heart because our inner being is renewed each day, even though our body is being destroyed at the same time. The present burden of our trial is light enough and earns for us eternal weight of glory beyond all comparisons. We do not fix our gaze on what is seen, but on what is unseen. What is seen is transitory, what is unseen lasts forever. I have a new meaning when I read that. That words now live in me. Without some of the definitions and some of the meanings and some of the things that he wrote in this book, I just read it and just move on and say, well, I have faith in Christ, I have faith in Christ, I have faith in Christ. That brings me meaning, and I'm glad for all you people, for all your perspectives. And if we are going to do something else on Steiner, maybe Carson's right, maybe we should move on to something else, Barfield or even Whitehead, because I really enjoy Matt's Whitehead stuff. But I think we need, as a Christian, as a Roman Catholic, his definition of karma. Somehow I think we all have his. I'd like to know what Steiner's version of karma is, if anybody want to do that. But thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Very appropriate couple of lines from Corinthians there that you've shared, and appreciate your participation these last months. Ashton, please.
Can you all hear me? I'm on two different devices, so I'm speaking out of a different one. Thanks for sharing that, James. I actually think it might be, yeah, that's a good idea maybe for the next reading cycle to read one of the lecture cycles on karma. And just the way Steiner, brings the kind of metamorphic thinking to bear on, notions of karma, and even this kind of could connect with what Karsten and Angus were discussing earlier about the kind of just what kind of logic is behind this notion that there's in each successive life, there's a metamorphosis into the opposite sex. Even though he also qualifies and says that it's not like there's always exceptions. But anyway, that aside, yeah, I don't know if Matt mentioned this, but I've been at the Nature Institute and just drove all the way back from New York to California. And so haven't been able to, yeah, quite a journey. But I haven't been able to join the meetings, but I've been listening to the recordings, and yeah, just wanted to echo what others have said about the group and the feeling cultivated. And I also, the passage that Jeff brought up about this difference between the path of feeling and the path of thinking was something that I wanted to bring up as well, because I was trying to understand, like, what is it about the path of thinking for knowledge that sort of gives us more, I guess, of a buffer in this welter of influence that we find ourselves in. And I guess, just thinking back to the philosophy of freedom, that's this potential to select our own, moral imaginations, or cultivate certain kinds of thought images that stir certain kinds of feeling. And I feel like despite the plurality of backgrounds, and maybe actually, that's essential, that we're able to cultivate a kind of feeling here because of the kind of thinking that goes on, and the spirit of the thinking. And yeah, I'm just really grateful for that and excited for future cycles. And so one last thing, maybe also in the future, Charles Taylor just came out with a new book on romanticism. So it's a big book. I don't know if that's something you're going to read soon, but that might be interesting. Give Steiner a kind of context. But one last thing I wanted to mention was touching back to the conversation about Barfield and figuration. The first week of our time at the Nature Institute was focused on light and color. And in the beginning, there were these experiments that Henrika, in particular, Holdridge, set up, where we were and they didn't tell us this, we reflected on it later, but they set up these experiments that were like helping us to become conscious of the way in which our physical apparatus of the eye, and just being in space, how that just becoming like externalizing that in certain kinds of setups, and being able to understand how this physiological process works. And then later on, they gave us this text that we read about doctors who performed surgeries to help people who had been born blind recover sight, and how a lot of them, to their surprise, they couldn't immediately see, and some of them never would learn to see, and that those who could learn to see had to go through this long process of basically being able to acquire the concepts of like what their eyes were registering, but they didn't have, as Carsten was mentioning, that what we see with our eyes is saturated with a kind of spiritual intelligibility that we're also bringing to it, also based on our experience and the memories that we've accumulated, where we've been able to differentiate the world into a meaningful whole. So anyway, just wanted to mention that. And it's been great. Sad I wasn't able to participate in the last few meetings, but looking forward to the next cycle.
Thanks, Ashton. I know we're at time here, but I just can't help but amplify what you're saying, that some people who are of a more scientific materialist bent, if they read this text, they would say there's no empirical evidence for much of what Steiner is claiming here, where empiricism is supposed to be a careful attentiveness, an observation of our sensory experience. And so much of the way in which scientific materialism tries to ground itself in the sense empirical world is actually rooted in abstraction. And we think we're seeing something, but we're really projecting the model and ignoring what's present in our experience of color and warmth and sound. And if we really wanted to be empirical, we'd have to look again at our concrete experience and not superimpose these models between us and the phenomena. Because I think Steiner's really just saying, yeah, let's be empirical about this. Really, like look again, feel again, hear again, and see what's really present in those experiences. So I want to remind everyone about the pop-up on Friday. I posted the link in the chat, 9 a.m. Pacific this Friday. You'll see that also in the Substack. We're going to take a break in terms of reading for a couple months as we figure out where to go next. We're not done with the reading groups. We're definitely going to pick up again, and you'll be able to keep up with that and make suggestions and whatnot on the Substack page. So do stay in touch with us there in the meantime. And please, if you have an idea for a pop-up presentation, let us know. We'd be happy to host any number of different dialogues about texts by Steiner or other esoteric philosophic authors. But for now, this is goodbye. And yeah, thanks so much for your participation and your the warm feelings and striving that you've brought to these conversations.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
See you all soon.